This is the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcast, where we examine issues of interest to people who have found or who are seeking a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. Kylie Butler enjoyed a successful career in business where she reached what I think is some of the highest levels of success, seeking a role where her values and career would be more aligned. She eventually was presented with what I believe she described in one of her episodes as a gift wrapped in shit, maybe is what how you worded it. It sounded a lot
Yeah,
nicer with your accent.
that's no. That's exactly right. A gift in shitty wrapping
There
paper.
you go. And shitty wrapping paper. There you
Beautiful
go.
gift in shitty wrapping paper.
And
Yeah.
that gift was recovery from addiction to
hmm
alcohol. And you've been giving back ever since. You have a wonderful website and a podcast called A Meaningful Life by Design. And you use that to help others design meaningful lives for themselves, both in their career and their recovery. And I thought we could talk about a little bit of that. And in addition to being a great podcaster and writer, you're a recovery coach, a career coach, and much more. So today, you are my guest here on Beyond Belief Sobriety, and it's a real honor to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's absolute pleasure to be here, John. Thank you.
So, why don't we start, Kylie, with an introduction of you and your background, and we'll just kind of go through the story of how A Meaningful Life by Design came to be.
Mhm. Okay, great. So, in terms of a meaningful life by design, I can't really extrapolate the business story out from my personal story. It's all one, and
Yeah.
that's an aspect that I absolutely love about my life too. Because in my corporate career, I used to be two different personas. There was party cars and there was corporate cars, and I get suited and booted, and I worked in London and all these super corporate environments, and there were these different versions of who I am. And now I'm very clear. This is me, and this is how I
Right.
show up, and my business and my life and my work, and it all kind of it's all one. So a meaningful life by design is my current business. It's also a platform and it's a podcast, and it is essentially the way in which I help individuals bring their unique gifts to the world in a meaningful way. So it was initially an inspiring podcast and a career coaching business, and then when I went through my journey of recovery and got honest about my journey of recovery, I started to move my unique gifts into not just coaching individuals on a meaningful life and living within their values and how they find what is their chosen career path, purpose, passions, but also how, before we do that, how we recover from addictions. So, because really my journey, I mean, is it ever easy? I don't know if anyone would ever say, "Yeah, my recovery journey is really
Right.
easy," but I certainly made it difficult for myself by refusing to accept my alcoholism. So and I now see that as a huge gift because of all my struggles to get sober, of my desire to absolutely understand addiction from a neurological perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from an academic perspective, to understand addiction and both recovery and look at it from every angle and try all these different parts and fail and learn, has meant that it's given me a vast experience in an understanding of addiction and recovery. And now, I was already on the path of helping coach individuals find purpose and meaning and reason in their life. And now I do that through the lens of recovery,
You know,
and using all those coaching skills in recovery.
I recently took a course to become a peer support specialist in Missouri. And
hmm
I've never been open at work about my recovery, but I decided in this case to go ahead and do so. So I told my boss that I needed some time off because I want to take this class to be a peer support specialist. And that was the first time I ever
hmm
let her know I had anything to do with recovery. She thought it was great.
hmm
But what I found really interesting is when I took the class, I'm kind of like you. I said, wow, this would be really great at work. Because the class was all about helping people discover what their goals were in their own recovery, helping them
hmm
to identify any obstacles to achieving those goals, and then helping
hmm
them break through those obstacles. And I thought,
hmm
wow, I mean, that's just what anybody would need at work. So I could really see the parallel between, what you learned in business then in recovery and kind of putting the two
Mhm.
together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like coaching, in terms of what I learned on my initial coaching journey, it was like, why wouldn't we all have a coach? If you want to get better at tennis, you get a tennis coach. We all have these specialists and support people in all aspects of our life. But then when it comes to kind of mainstream life, we think we've got to be able to do that on our
Right.
own and get it right. And so, I mean, coaching can be for anyone in any realm where they're looking to optimize or, move closer to their goals. Coaching can be very profound assistance. But then in recovery, as you mentioned, like in recovery, we learn this whole other way of how do we live life without self-medicating. And that is, really developing all these other tools to live a better life. And for anyone who does the 12 steps as well, like for anyone who hasn't been in recovery, and then, when we learn about the 12 steps, we're like, these are just amazing principles for living life. Like,
Hmm.
what a gift that your life has to fall over before you learn
Right.
these gifts.
Right.
I've spoken to friends about, 12 steps, and they're like, do you have to have a problem with drugs and alcohol to use those? I'm like, you actually don't. You
No.
actually don't. Like to be able to say, hey, to accept the situation that you're in, to realize that you make mistakes, to take accountability and ownership of your mistakes, to make amends for those, to try and show up every day as a better version of yourself and try and give back and help others. What a wonderful way to live life. But in recovery, we get the gift of being given those tools. And I suppose what I'm doing now in terms of recovery coaching is combining all the tools that we use to get sober, the tools that anyone would learn on, work with a coach to achieve their goals in life, and kind of pull all of that together and help people on their journey.
Yeah.
And it can be used, in terms of working with a recovery coach, it can be because you don't like the 12-step path,
Hmm.
or you don't like traditional rehabs, or you don't like traditional psychotherapy, or it could be used in conjunction of those. So there are some people who are really I don't want to sponsor and I don't want to talk about my childhood. I just need to know how to get back on the path. My life's an absolute shit show right now. So how do we
Right.
deal with that?
Right.
Like, okay, let's, how do we deal with that? And that's what
Yeah.
recovery coaching can
Yeah,
be.
that's what I like about what I've been learning as
Mm,
well is that, everybody has to have their own path and everybody has to direct their own way through
mm,
their recovery. And I guess what you're doing is helping people make their way down the path that they want to go.
mm,
And for some people it might be 12 steps, for some people it might not be. I've gotten myself to the point where I'm just happy that anybody finds any way
mm,
that to the recovery that works for them. Um,
mm-hmm,
and I've unfortunately been around the recovery community for a long time, and there can sometimes be people that put themselves in camps. So my camp
mm,
is this, and this is the right way to do it. Blah blah blah. I think that's
mm,
beginning to break down now more because
mm,
of I think actually I think COVID had a lot to do with it because people were kind of forced now to find each other online, and they're meeting people outside of their own local communities, and they're getting ideas from people from all over the world, and finding that there's more than one way to think about things. I think it's going to
mm,
change a bit of our recovery culture so that people are more accepting now of the many different paths that can be taken.
mm. Yeah,
So,
yeah, which is really brilliant, because it's a challenge, and I thought it certainly was a roadblock to me when I first started considering getting into recovery, because I was pretty stubborn. I was going to learn to drink like normal people. I wasn't going to give it up. And I did rehab before I was even ready to get sober. Because my life was falling apart, but I still didn't want to get sober. And I really resisted. Now I'm really embracing of all the different ways, just like you said, whatever works for you, awesome. you know
yeah.
um, but when I was first introduced to I'm not sure how open you are in terms of the talking about the secret societies here, but when I was first introduced to the 12-step paths,
Uh-huh.
I was like, this is not for me. And then there's a lot of flaws in traditional rehab as well. There is a very low success rate of a lot of rehabs. They work on making money through insurance, trying to
Mm-hmm.
fix people in 28 days. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of flaws. I've also come across a lot of dodgy business, and that playing on the vulnerable. It's a brilliant business model. get people in, 95% of them relapse and bring them back in the door again. So there's a lot of, flaws to, and so then, and when I was very resistant to recovery as well, I was like, well, I'm not going to go down that path, and I'm not going to go down that path. Now I'm really open to all of the different paths. But to your point, we really need to find our own way, what works for us.
And you described this 12-step process beautifully just a few minutes ago. And I think that you've also realized that the 12 steps, they don't encompass everything, that you really need more of a holistic approach, because you write a lot about, diet, exercise, things like that, which
and complex trauma.
Yes. And trauma and dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
Which
I
the
heard
steps
a beautiful,
don't cover.
That's exactly right. But funnily enough, Bill Wilson was a traumatized child who also used, and this is a whole nother conversation, plant medicines. So, there's a lot of stuff that's not in, there's not in the 12 steps. And I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's a lot of beautiful aspects to the 12 steps, like the community and all the things that I mentioned in terms of those fundamental principles about just living in acceptance, trusting in the universe, owning your own shit, being accountable, showing up and helping other people. I mean, what beautiful principles. And I've met some absolute rock stars, just gems of human beings in the fellowship. But I suppose my problem with the fellowship, if it's used in isolation, is that a lot of people are self-medicating, a deep psychological wound with alcohol or drugs. And when they put down the drugs, that wound's still there. So, good diet, spiritual principles, meditation, yoga, fellowship, meeting people, helping others, these are all absolutely wonderful. But if there's a deep trauma wound, then that doesn't go away. And what will tend to happen is somebody picks up something else, or they get obsessed with something else. And so it's just that, they talk about something, whack the mold, it pops up somewhere else, or people need to get obsessive around certain things because they haven't dealt with, and that hole that they were initially looking to fill with drugs. And I heard a beautiful analogy on a podcast recently. So I finally I could credit the person, but it was gorgeous. But the analogy was essentially, addiction is all around. There is a gun, and the unloaded gun is your genetics, and then the bullet in the gun is trauma. And now what we know from recent studies is there is no absolute gene for alcoholism. It does come down through the bloodlines, but it comes down because of epigenetics and because of this gene to be sensitive. And the people who are really sensitive souls are more likely to pick it up, and their parents are more likely to pick it up. And if you were in a house where there was dysfunction because of alcohol or addiction, then you're more likely to pick it up. But it's not as simple as an addiction gene. So, But if you have that sensitive gene and you've been in an environment that's been, if you grew up in a house where there was active alcoholism or addiction, it's unlikely that your 5 core emotional needs as a child were met. So there's some fractures in kind of the fundamental wiring of your mind from the very early years. That kind of sits there. Now, without trauma, the gun doesn't go off. Right. You kind of live life and you're okay, But if you have that sensitive soul without their emotional needs being met, and they're out in the world and there's some kind of level of trauma, then we have addiction. And when I say trauma, I'm not talking, it doesn't have to be, physical abuse, sexual abuse. It can be, we have what we call as kind of in the trauma world, big T's and little T's.
Right.
And in the formative years, this is where the kind of control panel is being wired. In those very formative years when our brains are very plastic, when we're learning to understand the world and ourselves in context in the world, how we be vulnerable, invulnerable, how we build self-esteem, give love, receive love, whether we have inherent worth in who we are. When we're learning those essence elements of ourselves in our early years, if we're not in a great environment, we can kind of struggle for the rest of our lives. And then you throw some kind of being hit, being abandoned, moving around a lot, parents who are alcoholic, being lonely, being misunderstood, or to our sensitive little souls. That's the stuff that causes a real wound. And I mean, there's stats around. Sorry, I'm on a roll here now. But with the,
Mm-hmm.
if you have, a certain amount of significant trauma in early childhood, something like 4,900% you're going to be an
Wow.
intravenous drug user. So it's not like 5%, 10%, 50%. It's not double your
Wow.
chances. It's so high that you're going to be, a drug user if you experience significant trauma. And that isn't dealt with through the 12 steps.
No, isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Even in my own
Yeah.
stories, I look back, and I started drinking so young. I
Mm,
recognize now that my drinking was always to medicate, was always to change the way that
mm,
I felt. That I always had that need. And then when my drinking really went off the cliff, it was right after a very traumatic experience. Didn't recognize it at the time that that had anything to do
mm,
with what was going on in my life, but I certainly do now.
mm.
And so, yeah, that the link between trauma and addiction is really interesting and something I'm really just beginning to learn about. You mentioned a word though that I find interesting that a doctor was telling me about, epigenetics.
Mhm,
Is that where? Because I'm not really good at this stuff, but is that where
mhm.
trauma is like passed down from generations? That you somehow change your genetic structure because of some experience in your life. Is that what that is? Or do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so I'm not a scientist either, but yeah, I think you've captured it quite nicely. In essence, the genes fold differently based on experiences, and it's passed down from generation to generation. So
Yeah.
that's when we see traumatic experiences. So if your mother has the loss of a child, or is in a detention center or something like that, the experiences of those traumas are passed from generation to generation.
Yeah. I find that really, really
Yeah.
interesting and very
Mm,
true too. And what I'm kind of happy about in my own personal life anyway is that I think that with me it stopped because I can see generationally
mm,
it being passed on from grandfather to mother to me. But
mm.
I fortunately, for whatever reason, was able to find recovery in a community so that hopefully I'm not going to pass that on any further.
Oh, you just said the most, like, honestly, that lands in my heart. It's so beautiful because a big thing about recovery that I feel as well, and it's not talked about that often, is, we say, addiction's not our fault, but recovery is our responsibility. And that responsibility is actually to the next generation as
Isn't
well.
it though?
Because
Yep.
until we own this, it keeps going on down the line.
It sure
And if we
does.
look at my whole kind of family tree, because I, at first, just like you, I was like, how did this happen to me? No mental health problems. There was no like addiction in my family. Everything looked all shiny and great. And then we started plotting out the trauma that sat in my mother's bloodline and my father's bloodline, generations up. And it was explained very simply to me as like, I'm the squeaky wheel in the family system. I was the one that spoke to all this other stuff that everybody else hid. And they had it,
Right.
and it came up for them as depression or anxiety, and they pushed it down. But I was this alcoholic who was going out and getting really drunk and just,
Mm-hmm.
and going missing and doing all this stuff that could not be ignored. And so, but in that healing, if I heal it with, my gym, I mean, I'm not planning to have children, but, I play an active role in in my niece's life. And so it doesn't go on another generation. But
Right.
until it's resolved, and I'm sure you've met people like this as well, they're the children of active alcoholics and of active alcoholics or addicts or generations up. And if and they've got children themselves, if the individual doesn't deal with it, it gets carried on through the genes, and gets carried on in the way the addict interacts with others. So if we take responsibility for our recovery, it's not that we heal the next generation. And also the ripple effect of, think about every positive conversation that you've had with everyone who's tried to get sober, or just needed some support or needed to be understood. Like, the ripple effect of your healing is so powerful.
Yeah. So, can you talk a little bit about what you do as a recovery coach? I know that you have like three different types of programs that you offer. And maybe if you can talk a little bit about that and how you approach somebody who is coming to you um, for help as a coach.
Yeah, sure. So the way it's actually, I'm in the process because my original business, A Meaningful Life by Design, was all career coaching, and then I've moved that into recovery coaching,
Interesting.
and
Okay.
now and got some new accreditations as well, to back up all the stuff that I have
And
in
again,
terms
I
of
see
my
the two going
experience.
together so well.
They
Seriously.
do, they do, they do, they do.
That's kind
And
of
but at
fun.
the moment, to simplify it, myself and another recovery coach are going to be building another standalone site called From Here On, which really
Okay.
talks to exactly from this point on in recovery. How I work at the moment is I work in isolation, and I also work with an institute called the Living Free Institute. And basically, whenever anyone comes to me and said, "Look, hey, look, I don't work with people who aren't sober yet." So, because
Okay.
I don't have detox
Right.
that's an art form. So I'll work with someone. So they might have just got out of a medical detox, or just got out of rehab, or relapsed before, or been in recovery, or done any kind of recovery before, and maybe relapsed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's somebody who's like, okay, I've just got sober, or I'm struggling to stay sober, or I'm newly sober. And when they come to me, I'll say, look, the way that we'll either work is we can work in isolation. So they work with me, where we set some goals around recovery. We work with cognitive behavioral therapy. We work with mindfulness training, get very clear on who they are, the relationship to their thoughts, what are their goals, what is their environment like, how do we set up every day for success, is kind of the very fundamentals of recovery coaching. But I'll do an assessment on where they're at, because they may need and where I work with the Living Free Institute is if somebody is, say, in early recovery, if they've had a traumatic relapse or something really significant, if they've never been in recovery before, what they may need. So we do intensive programs where they'd work with a clinical psychologist, they'd work with myself as a recovery coach, they'd work with a yoga instructor, and with a mindfulness coach. So for people who are looking for like an outpatient type, if you want to do rehab, but do it from home, that is mind, body, and spirit. Because as we know, addiction
Oh,
is a very complex neurological condition. We hold
right.
trauma in the body, so there's like a very intensive option where you can work with the clinical psychologist on
Right.
processing childhood trauma. You can work with me on how do we set up every day for success, and your day,
Excellent.
week, year, and your goals.
Yep.
And then work with if a meditation teacher and yoga teacher. So often that way I'll work with somebody twice a week, and then they'll
Yep.
work with the other specialists on the past and the body and their mind as well. Or if they're kind of just in a place of just, I've come out of rehab, I feel okay, but I need some support. I don't want to be delving into my childhood, what happened in the cot. I'm not looking for a sponsor. And
Right.
so often I work well at, the person might do 1 or 2 meetings, but they'll work with me on, okay, what are my goals in recovery? And they'll often have goals around all aspects of their life. So just, to stay sober. They'll
Yeah.
have some goals around relationships, some goals around career, some goals around finances, health and wellness, and all of those go together. So we'll talk around, how do you set up every day for success? What is your relationship to your thoughts? In terms of, do you have any cognitive distortions? How do you
Mm-hmm.
be kind to yourself? How do you work with your inner critic? And then how do we set up your life to work with those goals? Check, and there's a level of accountability as well. Okay, so we've set up some goals. Are you going to do 10 minutes of meditation every day? We'll check in once, twice a week. Are you doing those? Are you doing your yoga once a week?
Mm-hmm.
How's your diet going? Because all of these things support recovery. Are you connecting to others? Do you have a sense of tribe? Are the people that are in your life enhancing your life? So all of these things that just keep people. And so I've got clients that I work with that started out in an intensive program,
Mm-hmm.
and now they just work with me once or twice a week. We kind of check in. They've got someone they keep accountable to, can deal with what life's throwing at them. Like, this is coming up at work, and this is where I'm going. Okay, let's come back to this problem and where you're going in your mind, and how you're catastrophizing this, and let's put it back into perspective. And so it's somebody who really supports them in the journey of life and in
Mm-hmm.
the journey of recovery, and also understands, and we're like, hey, been thinking about drinking recently? They're like, like, how's that fantasy going? You know, like,
Yeah.
and I know, like, yeah, play the tape forward, buddy. You know, we know where
Yeah.
that goes. And, you know, and I've played out all those fantasies. My drinking got pretty crazy.
Hmm.
So I've done rehab numerous times. I've been to all the different fellowships. So, I understand the mind of, of an addict and the crazy things we do. And a lot of the piece of recovery coaching as well is there's working towards your goal, having an advocate, a coach, a
Yes.
supporter, a
Yeah.
mentor, a strategist. There's that piece there, and there's also the piece that there's somebody who gets you. And a lot of what I do at the start of working with someone is helping alleviate that shame. It's just like, hey buddy, this is what your mind was doing because you needed to soothe that deep psychological wound. And the complexity of your mind and your capability to self-soothe, it's really powerful. But that way that you were teaching yourself of medicating doesn't work anymore. But there's nothing wrong with you. It's what's happened to you. And a lot of really just, it is a complex neurological position. There's nothing wrong with you morally, although you may not have behaved in line with your values, but we can work with that now. We can leave the past in the past. And from this point on, we can help you build a life that's aligned to your values and your principles and where you want to be. Because there's so much shame wrapped up in
Yeah.
an addiction. And it's just, it's another illness. It's a very complex illness that's really misunderstood. And, it's nice to be able to work with people and help them move past that shame, because that's really, really debilitating. And it took me a long time to move past the shame.
I can really see the value in this, and I'm so glad to see that this trend is going on, recovery coaching, peer support, because I would be more comfortable, I think, as a person in early recovery. I think I'd be much more comfortable talking to someone like you who's been there and will be talking to me in maybe my own language, but you have the experience, than I would be maybe I might not be so open up in the beginning with a therapist, especially if I'm not experienced with it. And and I might later find myself, like I eventually did, go to therapy. But I think I would have benefited a great deal from having somebody like that in my corner that I could talk to, that could speak my language, that wasn't necessarily, like a sponsor or, having me go down one particular path, so I could really see some
Yeah.
value in that. And especially the program you talked about where you have the three components with the yoga and the therapist and with you. Makes total sense.
Yeah, so mind, body, and spirit, because a lot of it's, we trap emotions in our body as well, and the power of mindfulness and being able to come back to the present moment, that could not get caught up in our anxieties and fears of worry of the past. They're the things we drink over, because we can go into shame or regret or remorse or intense in fear or anxiety. But if we can come back to the present moment and train our mind to do that. So recovery coaching, mindfulness is a big part of it. But then if somebody wants a more intensive program, then they can work with, mindfulness or even breath work coach. But to come back to what you said before, I've worked with different therapists throughout my life too, and therapists and coaches, and there's just something so unique about addiction. Especially the best clinical psychologist that I ever work with, that I refer people with, is an expert in the neuroscience of mental health and was an addict as well. And there's something about someone who you can say, yeah, I used to hide bottles under the bed like you too, and you can laugh about it.
Yeah.
And people who haven't been there just don't get that. And the other thing with recovery coaching as well is if the person slips, so whether it's a lapse or a full relapse, for someone they can talk to, who's going to be like, okay, it's part of the process, happened to me. What do we learn from this one? It's a little bit
How
of a
did you
course
learn all of
correction.
this? You're speaking
Yeah.
language that I really like. I learned that the difference between lapse and relapse in smart recovery. They talk about they distinguish
Okay.
that, and there is an important distinction, that a relapse is a full going back to your previous behaviors, where a lapse might be maybe you had some drinks and maybe that wasn't so great, maybe it was dangerous, but
Yeah.
you didn't completely relapse into your former
Yeah.
ways.
Out of control again.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. Like, I tried smart recovery, but I mean, it didn't gel with me because I was also working with a clinical psychologist who had done quite a bit of CBT, and it's a little bit 101 CBT.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how it's, a very powerful program. For me, because I refused to get sober for so long, I did a lot of because I was like, I'm going to fix this so I can drink normally. So I studied a lot around the neuroplasticity. I really looked at all the different ways of how the mind worked in addiction, different ways of recovering. Yeah, because I wanted to drink moderately.
Right.
And what I know now is that if we look at, say, criteria like the DSM-5 and look at, how from a moderate, mild, moderate to severe addiction, if you're at mild and you're essentially like a heavy drinker, your body will still go back to homeostasis. You could stop drinking and maybe you can drink again in the happy days, but like you were. But what's happened when you get to severe addiction is in terms of the way that your brain is wired, you don't go back to homeostasis. And anyone who's been a really heavy drinker or drug user who's gone out again and realized that they're back to drinking a bottle of vodka a day or back to, the drug dealer on intravenous drugs straight away will have experienced that firsthand. You just can't go back to the early fun days and moderate drinking. It just doesn't work like that. The wiring has essentially changed. Now you build new neurological pathways, new healthy pathways of coping with your emotions and not drinking. And like personally, I don't think about drinking. I don't miss drinking. I go to parties with people who drink. I get bored and I go home. It's not. My trigger is actually around emotions and loneliness. So if I was to, and actually you brought up an interesting point before. My big, when things really kicked off was when it was a traumatic event that ripped the Band-Aid off some childhood trauma of all of this stuff that I'd never dealt with and didn't realize. And it took me years to work it out as well. So, yeah.
So when you talk about the different places on the spectrum where addiction falls, again, this is something I'm learning so much later in life, but I read a wonderful book that I love and I talk about quite a bit, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. And she talks in that book about addiction being a spectrum disorder and that you can be anywhere on the spectrum. Like maybe I was way over on the far end of the spectrum, but other people might be on the lighter end of it. And, her point was that, it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, that making a decision not to drink is just a healthy choice for anybody. And in one of your blog posts that I was kind of wanting to talk about, and this is a good place to talk about it, I guess, you talk a little bit about the sober curious people, which I think that's a great trend. I'm learning more about that. And can you talk a bit about what that is, the sober curious person?
Yeah, good question. Now, being that I'm not super curious myself, I'm actually a severe addict that that really needed for the betterment of the world and everyone in my immediate world. I needed to get sober, but sober curious. I mean, it's where I live. So I live in Bali, and there's a lot of the conscious community live here. A lot of people who are veganism, who are essentially looking at a more pure way to, nourish mind, body, and spirit. And I mean, Sober Curious is essentially a movement where people look at getting sober, at not drinking, not necessarily because they're an addict that needs to go to recovery, but because it's potentially something that'll work better for them. Like alcohol is a depressant.
Yeah, it's not a healthy thing to put in your body.
And it's a poison. Yeah. It's a poison, and it's so there's a lot of myths around the health of alcohol. And look, you know what? If it works for you, no judgment. If someone can go out and have a few drinks or go out and get drunk, and they wake up the next day and they don't hate themselves, well, good for you. Awesome. I think we've all got to find a way that works for us. And the Sober Curious movement is people who are like, you know what? Maybe drinking doesn't work for me. I don't really I can stop. I'm not that out of control, but maybe it would be a better way of life. And it's interesting, like my generation, and especially in Australia, it's like you don't trust someone who doesn't drink. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you if you don't drink. And you drink to get drunk. That's pretty normal behavior. Like when, like in my kind of partying days, like we'd drink and drug all weekend and really thought that there was nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My whole peer group did that,
Yeah.
but there's a new generation coming through that look at, what, and in the work that I do with businesses around their people and culture strategy, we were finding that in terms of reward and recognition programs, some of the younger generation don't want money behind the bar anymore. They want Pilates. Like
Yeah.
there's a whole new generation of people who are more conscious of questioning about what they're putting in their body and questioning whether alcohol is going to work with them. Just like we would question, does monogamy work for me? Does marriage work for
Right.
me? Does a 9-to-5 job work for me? Does everyone used to drink to have a good time? Does that really work for me? And there's a lot of people who are making conscious decisions around their lives and whether alcohol fits into their lives. And if they're using it there's a lot of people who exactly on that spectrum would not be a severe alcoholic, but they use alcohol in unhealthy ways, and it doesn't work for them, So any of those people could benefit to, get on track in recovery. And as we said, the 12 steps is a really nice program for anyone.
Right, it is. It is. I also like the fact that it kind of, and I think in a bit kind of takes the stigma away from not drinking. That it kind of normalizes that this is just a healthy choice that I'm making not to drink. It can be difficult for some people early in their recovery to go to the workplace, for example, and have to deal with drinking situations. And, people want to know why you're not drinking. I mean, all these things kind of come up. But if if our society is moving into a way with alcohol, the way that we did with cigarettes, where you just kind of say, oh, no, I'm just not going to drink because it's not healthy. It's just like I don't smoke.
Yeah.
It just kind of takes
Totally.
that
Like
stigma
I used to
away.
always, it does. I used to, before when I was still trying to just stop drinking in spurts and then go back to drinking normally, I used to always just say I was doing like a juice, like I was at a work thing, I was saying I'm doing a juice fast or I'm doing a cleanse. Or doing detoxes is very trendy. So they don't know that you're actually detoxing because you had like alcoholic poisoning and you had to go to hospital. But it's like, yeah, my detox started in an ambulance, but but yeah, I mean, it's just a healthy choice. It's just a healthy choice. It's a healthy choice whether you had a problem with booze or whether you didn't have a problem with booze.
Yeah. So you mentioned the community in Bali and how people are interested in, I guess, becoming more healthy spiritually and in different ways. I'm not familiar with Bali, but it looks like a beautiful place. And can you talk about what got you to move there? What keeps you there? What is it about Bali that's special for you?
Sure. Okay. And I'll give you the real story as well.
Good.
Because I used to, I mean, it's a beautiful life. I mean, I always tell the truth now before, but the same as when I used to say that I was just doing detoxes. That's why I wasn't drinking. But I used to say that, I worked here I moved here because of the co-working situations and there's a great startup community. And that is true. But the honest truth is, I had a relapse over here, ended up in a rehab, built a very strong community. There's a very strong recovery community here. And like a lot of places in the world where there's a strong party community, there's a strong recovery community.
Interesting.
So Bali is a really, and for me, Bali is a very spiritual island. They have a Balinese Hindu, distinct from the rest of Indonesia, which it's predominantly Muslim country. And Bali has this unique blend of Hinduism, which is a mix of animism and Hindu, and there's always blessings and worship, and they worship lots of different gods, and it's just an island that has an incredibly beautiful energy, and the people are very kind and very conscious, and so there are lots of elements that make it a very special place. That in terms of recovery, so it's one of those places. There's a few around the world. You've got Ibiza, you've got conscious community. Goa, you've got conscious community. Boulder, there's different places in the US where you have these kind of spiritual conscious communities. There's a big conscious community in Bali. It's also a bit of a drug hub for Asia. So there's a big, it's a very fascinating little island. There's a big drug culture, then pops up a big recovery culture, and then there's also a consciousness community here as well. So it's very, like, there's an area, Ubud, where if I go out with all my buddies up there who I've met on retreat, we've gone to Buddhist meditation retreats together, done, all those kind of things. And like my group of friends up there just don't drink. I'll wear like, oh my God, nobody drank. And they don't identify as sober. They just don't
Right.
drink.
Yeah.
They don't eat meat, and they meditate, and they, have a walking a spiritual path. And that means not putting chemicals into their body. So there's kind of that community. And there's also the strong recovery. So there's AA and NA here. It's a softer approach to, I've never done fellowship in the US before, but of my understanding, there can be a bit more delineation between AA and NA.
Right.
The communities kind of blend here a bit.
Uh-huh.
I'll pop in and out of either depending on what's on
Right.
the night that I feel like going to a meeting. What's on tonight? Oh, okay. Then I can have an addict tonight. Tomorrow I'm an alcoholic. But I really just, I like the community and the principles.
Yeah.
But there's also, because it's an affordable, like in the US, I think, people go to Mexico or they go to Miami and they go off to rehabs. It's also an affordable place to go and pop yourself away. So you can go on holidays for 28 days. And it's not comparatively, to do rehab here is less expensive.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the same, I will say, having done and needed to do proper medical detoxes before, because so we know the danger of those early stages of withdrawal, they're very dangerous.
Sure.
My experience has been, medical detoxes always need to be done with absolute professionals. And, if anybody is ever assessing to put themselves into a detox or rehab or a medical detox, to have somebody who really knows that stuff to assess the level of care that they're given in those early days. It's really pivotal.
And you've given back. There's an organization, I guess, that you were belong with, maybe started, Bali Aid. Can you talk about that and what's going on with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So at the start of the crisis, myself and a couple of others co-founded Bali Aid, which is all around, just giving back in the time of crisis and helping. Initially, what we did is we paired up with Scholars of Sustenance, SOS, which was all about feeding the most vulnerable. So really like a kind of crisis response at the start of the crisis. So Bali, about 85% of the island here depends on tourism. So when the borders were shut, there were all these people that had moved, so very poor Balinese that had moved to the cities and were earning money off driving foreigners around and working in the spas, and that type of stuff. All of those jobs just disappeared. There's a whole big sector of Bali that it has like kind of 2-week holidays, cheap holidays. So it's a little bit like in Ibiza, you've got San Antonio, you've got this aspect of the island, which is a lot of cheap holidays. So all of that, that market just disappeared. So there was a huge, and people who'd come from other islands to Bali to survive, all their jobs were gone. So what we did initially was just got people together and did some fundraising. So, for anyone who'd enjoyed Bali, it's an island that just gives back so much. So a lot of people come here to fall apart, to put themselves back together again, to have a beautiful holiday. So that the idea of the initial campaigns at Bali Aid was all around reciprocity. So giving back to the island that's given so much. So we ran some campaigns there, and now I'm doing fundraising with the Togetherness Project and Tanam Saja, which are again 2 other projects that are all around giving back in a more sustainable way. So the Togetherness Project is ikat weaving, coffee farming, and honey farming. So helping people return to their original traditions. So raising some funds to help them get back to, working back in the land and back to the arts, and the incredible ways that the Balinese were living here previously. And Tanam Saja is all around community gardening and planting seeds. Okay. So educating, schools and families on how to develop community gardens and farm for themselves and live off the land. So just more sustainable initiatives to help at this stage in the crisis while the island's still struggling.
Okay. If you have a
Yeah,
link or something where people can go to help out with that, I'd be glad to post that with the show notes, and maybe some people will help out.
absolutely.
Never
That
know.
would be amazing. Yeah, for
Yeah.
anyone who's ever been to this magical island and wants to give back, or just wants to give back to causes that are helping through the global crisis, helping people return to traditions and economic stimulation and job creation rather than just kind of handouts. So
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I'll give you
Yeah.
some links, and yeah, any support would be greatly appreciated.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I'm really honored to have you here. It was amazing to learn about you and what you do in your website and your podcast. I just think you do great work. I've learned a lot from talking to you. I think that listeners will learn a lot as well, and it'll be interesting to follow you to see how things progress over there. So, thank you again very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, John. So wonderful to speak to you today and to your listeners.
Yes. So, if I press the right button here, yeah, there we go. And that's it. That's another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to help out our podcast, a couple ways you can do it. You can go over to patreon.com/ Beyond Belief Sobriety and become a patron, or you can just go over to our website and buy us a cup of coffee or click on the PayPal button. But you don't even have to do that if you can't, because we're going to podcast anyway because we just like doing it. Thank you again. It was really wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Kylie.
Thank you. Thanks, John.